welcome to the deep dive.
Yeah.
We're diving deep into Eskrima today.
Oh, yeah. The Filipino martial art.
Exactly. Known for its stick fighting and its really effective self-defense techniques.
Yeah.
And our guide for this journey is a really comprehensive book by Krishna Godhania. It's called Eskrima Filipino Martial Art.
And it really is a fascinating book. One of the things that strikes you straight away is how much of a personal story it is.
Okay.
Because he dedicates it to his family, his mom and dad, his wife, his children.
Right.
But also to his teacher, Grandmaster Abner Pasa.
Okay.
Which already gives you a clue about that passing down of knowledge and lineage.
Yeah.
And importantly as well, he acknowledges all the people that have helped with photography and things like that.
Yeah.
And importantly as well, there's a disclaimer at the start.
Of course, for safety.
Yeah. You know, don't try this at home and all that kind of stuff. But it's great. I mean, you know, for you listening to this book really is a treasure trove. It covers everything from the history principles. It goes into single stick, double stick, knife defense, empty hands.
Wow.
The long staff, flexible weapons, projectiles. So all sorts of stuff, as well as training methodology and the philosophy behind it.
Well, that's good because we like to go deep.
Absolutely.
So this looks like the perfect source for that. So what we're going to try and do in this deep dive is to extract the most interesting and significant nuggets that we can find and give you a shortcut to understanding Eskrima without you having to, go through every single page of the book. Absolutely.
And I think that's what Krishna Godhania wanted as well.
So
where do we start?
Yeah. Where does the story of Eskrima begin?
Well, it's interesting because, as you start reading this, you realize that so much of the early history of Eskrima is actually shrouded in a bit of mystery. Because before the kind of late 20th century, there aren't that many written records.
Oh, wow.
So a lot of it has been passed down through oral tradition from generation to generation.
So just word-of-mouth stories.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a lot of martial arts. It's been, kept within families, within small groups.
Right.
But, the general consensus is that if you're looking for the birthplace of Eskrima, you have to go to the Visayas region of the Philippines, and in particular to the island of Cebu.
Cebu. Okay. Now, is there one figure that stands out from this early period?
Well, you can't really talk about the history of Eskrima without mentioning Lapu-Lapu.
Okay. Now, who is Lapu-Lapu?
Well, he is a key figure. And why he's a key figure is because of the Battle of Mactan, which happened in 1521. And basically, this was a battle where he and his warriors famously repelled the Spanish conquistadors, led by Ferdinand Magellan. And in that battle, what's interesting is they used a variety of weapons.
Like what?
So we know that they used spears, swords, and interestingly sharpened sticks. Because that's the first kind of historical reference we have.
To what would become Eskrima?
Yeah, to the kind of fighting methods that would evolve into Eskrima.
Okay.
And, of course, in that battle, Ferdinand Magellan met his demise.
He did?
Yeah.
Now, is that because of Lapu-Lapu, or is that, we're not sure?
Well, legend has it that Lapu-Lapu delivered the finishing stroke himself.
Right.
And there are paintings that actually depict that moment.
Wow. So it's a pretty big deal.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, this guy's a bit of a national hero in the Philippines.
Okay. So we can speculate that before the Spanish arrives, Eskrima was, probably a tribal martial art.
Yeah. It seems that each tribe kind of developed its own unique style of fighting.
Right. And would they have kept their techniques secret, or would they?
Oh, absolutely. This was closely guarded knowledge.
Right.
Because remember, in those days, it was all about survival.
Yeah.
If another tribe had a better fighting system than you were in trouble.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Well, so then the Spanish came, and they colonized the Philippines.
Yep.
And primarily through the church. I guess they dismantled the warrior class?
Yeah, they basically outlawed the carrying of bladed weapons.
So what happened to Eskrima?
Well, this is where it had to adapt.
Yeah.
And Eskrima went underground.
Okay.
Masters were forced to train in secret. And instead of using these blades, they started using rattan sticks as substitutes.
Okay. So it became a lot safer to train as well, I guess.
Yeah, and they could train more regularly without, worrying about cutting each other to bits.
Right.
But what happened was that the training became very secretive. And, they would only teach family members or very select students.
Okay. So it was a real test of resilience for the art.
Yeah, absolutely. And they used to have these personal duels.
Oh, right.
To kind of test their skill.
Right.
Often in private.
Okay. So is this where we start to see a link between Eskrima and European fencing?
Well, there's a really interesting theory.
Okay.
Because in the late 1880s, there were some Filipino exiles that were living in Spain. And some prominent figures like Jose Rizal were amongst those.
Okay.
And it's thought that they actually studied fencing while they were there.
Right. So there's the link, because the word fencing in French
Eskrima.
and eskrima in Spanish is very similar to eskrima.
Absolutely. So whether or not there was a direct kind of connection, it's hard to say, but certainly that linguistic link is fascinating.
Yeah, it is. So then we move into the 20th century.
Yeah.
And Cebu is still a very central point in Eskrima.
Absolutely.
And the Labrador Fencing Association is formed in 1920.
Yes.
And this is significant because this is the earliest recorded martial arts association.
Yeah, in the Philippines.
In the Philippines. So what does that tell us about how Eskrima was evolving?
Well, I think it signifies a move towards a greater organization within the art. People started to see the value in sharing knowledge amongst these different Eskrima stylists. And at this time, the dominant styles were still heavily based on the techniques of these long blades. But what's interesting is that, you had these Cebuano Escrimador families, like the Saavedras. They were from Labangon.
Okay.
You had the Romos from Pasil,
right?
The Ilustrísimos from Donabantayan, and then you had these lesser-known but equally respected figures like Pablo Alicante.
Okay. So lots of different styles starting to come together.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've got this mix of, the more established families and these kind of, these lone wolves, if you like, who've got their own unique approach.
Yeah. Okay. Now, the Labangon Association, unfortunately, was relatively short-lived.
It was.
It closed its doors in 1930 due to financial issues, as Grandmaster Eulogio Canape recalls in the book.
Yeah.
But then, just 2 years later, a new organization emerged.
It did. Dos Pairs.
Dos Pairs. Now, I like that name already. Tell me a bit about that.
Well, Dos Pairs, it means 12 peers.
Right.
And it's named after Charlemagne's 12 legendary swordsmen.
Oh, wow. Okay. So there's a conscious link there to a heroic martial tradition.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that many of the Escrimadors from that Labangon Association, they ended up joining Dos Pairs.
Right. So it was a continuation.
It was a continuation of that lineage.
Wow. Okay. So World War II comes along.
Yeah.
And Eskrima masters find themselves
on the front line.
On the front line.
Unexpectedly.
Unexpectedly.
Yeah.
So they enlisted in the Bolo Battalion. Now, what can you tell me about that?
Well, I think it really highlights the practical, combat-ready nature of Eskrima, because here you've got these guys that have been training with sticks, and they're suddenly thrust into a war, and they've got the bolo, which is this machete-like sword, and it was the weapon of choice, because you've got this dense jungle.
Yeah, of course, in the Philippines.
And their expertise in close-quarters combat was invaluable against the Japanese. And they used all sorts of interesting tactics. Well, there's a mention of the triangle formation, where you would have the most skilled Eskrima master at the front engaging the enemy, and the others would provide flanking protection.
Wow. So it wasn't just individual skill.
Yeah.
It was tactical awareness as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow. So after the war, there's a huge amount of growth in the formation of organizations and clubs from the 1950s through to the 1970s.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it was a combination of things, really. After the war, there was this renewed interest in Filipino culture and heritage, but also transportation was improving, communication was improving.
So people could travel more easily?
Yeah, and different styles and practitioners had the opportunity to mix and share their knowledge.
Okay. So are there any key organizations that stood out from this period?
Yeah. So you had Santa Musa, which later became Semashika.
Okay.
And then you had clubs like Gerardo Larry Alquizar's Direct Self-Defense Club. That was 1959. You had Florencio Roca's Tornado Garrote Self-Defense Club in 1966, which was known for its no-holds-barred approach to training. So things were getting a bit more,
Yeah, a bit rougher.
A bit rougher.
Okay.
Yeah.
So was the 1970s when we saw, this big diversification in Eskrima?
Well, the 1970s was an important period.
It was.
Because you had Philemon Cabernet.
Yeah.
He founded the Lapunti Self-Defense Club in 1972.
Okay.
And they were famous for these abanico strikes.
Okay. Now, what is an abanico strike?
Well, abanico basically means fan. So imagine these really rapid fluid streaks.
Yeah.
Kind of like a fan's movement.
So unpredictable.
Very unpredictable.
Okay.
And you also had Napoleon Fernandez's Yayo Yan. Yeah, which was a distinct Filipino kicking art.
Okay.
And you had Magdaleno Nolasco's Black Cat Self-Defense Club.
Right.
Which taught Eskrito. Which was a blend of Eskrima and Judo.
Wow. So lots of different styles coming through at that time.
Yeah. So lots of experimentation, I think, going on. And different masters were kind of, blending different arts. Okay. Coming up with new systems.
Okay.
But at the same time, you also had the rise of sport Arnis tournaments.
Okay. So how did those two things coexist?
Well, I think that's one of the interesting things about Eskrima is you've got this growth of the formalized sport alongside this preservation of traditional styles. So in 1975, NARAFIL, which is the National Arnis Association of the Philippines, they were formed to promote and standardize the art for competition.
Okay.
And you had Arnis Philippines as well, which had a similar aim.
Okay. So did people see these things as, in conflict, or were they...
Well, I think there were some people that were, maybe a little bit wary of this sporting element because they felt that it might water down the effectiveness.
Yeah, have the original art.
But others embraced it because they saw it as a way to make Eskrima more popular.
More accessible.
Yeah, and accessible. And also to promote, Filipino culture on a world stage.
That's interesting. So this is when Abner Pasa steps in and establishes...
the Institute of Filipino Martial Arts.
Right, in the late 1980s.
Yeah.
Now, why did he do that?
Well, he felt that it was important to preserve these traditional styles that weren't really being represented in these sport Arnis tournaments.
Right.
So he wanted to make sure that this knowledge wasn't lost.
Okay.
And that it was passed down to future generations.
Yeah.
And of course, Eskrima wasn't confined to the Philippines for very long.
Yeah.
It started to spread around the world.
So how did that happen?
Well, it happened through some interesting avenues. You had a lot of these Eskrima masters.
Yeah.
They found work as sailors and cooks on these international vessels.
Right. So they traveled a lot.
They traveled the world. And as they traveled, they shared their art.
Okay. So where did it spread to first?
Well, Hawaii became an early hub.
Okay.
And figures like Floro Villabril became legendary in Eskrima circles. And then California played a huge role with pioneers like Juanito John Lacoste, Leo Giron, Angel Caballas.
Yeah.
Particularly in Stockton, they established these really thriving Eskrima communities.
Wow, okay. So when did it arrive in the UK?
Well, it reached the UK in 1975. Thanks to a guy called Rene Latosa. And then Dan Inosanto, who had studied with a number of Filipino masters. He introduced his own blended Kali system in 1979. Which further kind of broadened awareness.
Okay. So Kali's is...
it's a kind of generic term that's often used
to encompass
Filipino martial arts. And then in the 1990s, you had these Filipino masters visiting the UK. And that really helped to deepen understanding and practice.
Of more traditional Eskrima.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So back in the Philippines, we're starting to see the government recognize Eskrima.
Yeah.
Or Arnis, as they call it. Sometimes as a national sport in martial art.
Yeah. So in 1975, NARAFIL was formed. And this was under the leadership of General Fabian Ver. And they had a real push to try and unite all these Filipino Escrimadores under this one national organization. And then under President Marcos, there was a decree that was actually issued to include Arnis in the educational curriculum.
Wow. So it was really becoming...
ingrained in the culture.
Part of the national fabric?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So when was the first major open Arnis tournament?
Well, that was held in Cebu City in 1979.
And what happened there?
Well, it was dominated by Ciriaco Cacoy Canet, who was this incredibly skilled escrimador.
Wow.
And it really highlighted, the depth of talent that was coming out of Cebu at that time.
Okay.
So in modern sport Arnis, you tend to have these two main scoring formats. One emphasizes the technical execution, so you're rewarded for your precision and your form. And then the other is a more full contact approach, where participants wear protective gear. And this is the one that's generally more popular with spectators.
Because it's more exciting.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So, Eskrima is dynamic.
It is.
And its weapon-based techniques have caught the eye of Hollywood.
Oh, absolutely.
But we've seen it in a few films.
Well, after Bruce Lee, there was a film called Enter the Garrote.
Okay.
Which was filmed in Cebu.
Right.
And that showcased Filipino stick fighting.
Right.
And then you had Danny Nasanto appearing in various U.S. films in the 1980s. And more recently, you've had films like The Hunted.
The Hunted?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Jason Bourne trilogy.
Oh, wow. Okay. So it's actually being used in...
Yeah, they're using Filipino martial arts concepts in the fight choreography.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Well, we've talked a lot about the history.
We have.
And the evolution of Eskrima.
Yeah.
But what about the principles?
Yeah.
The core concepts that make it unique?
Well, the very first principle that Gadhania emphasizes is awareness.
Okay. So that's important in any martial art, I guess?
Mm-hmm. It is, but he goes a bit deeper than that. Okay. It's not just about being aware of your surroundings.
Right.
It's about not appearing vulnerable.
Okay.
So how you walk, how you hold yourself.
Right.
It's constantly assessing your environment,
Oh.
not only for potential threats, but also for escape routes.
Right.
And even improvised weapons.
Yeah.
You know, if you need to defend yourself, can you grab something and use it? And importantly, making intelligent choices to avoid dangerous situations in the first place. It's kind of a preventative measure to reduce your risk.
It's mental preparedness.
Absolutely.
Being mindful of your surroundings.
Yes.
And being mentally prepared to, maybe face multiple attackers.
Yeah.
Or armed attackers.
Yeah, exactly. It could give you those vital few seconds.
To react.
Yeah, or to escape and just get out of there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the environment has played a big part in the
development
development of Eskrima styles.
Yeah. The Philippines is made up of all these different islands, different terrain.
Yeah.
And that's really influenced the way that the art has evolved.
Okay. Can you give me some examples of how the environment has influenced the techniques?
Yeah. So if you think about the rice paddy regions of northern Luzon, where you've got these narrow, slippery pathways,
Right.
what you see is the development of these linear systems with low, stable stances, minimal footwork because you don't want to be slipping and sliding around.
Right.
Whereas if you go to somewhere like Western Visayas, where it's more open and flatter terrain, they favored the long stick.
Right.
Because they could use these broader sweeping movements.
Yeah.
And then in the more wooded or jungle areas, you'd see a preference for the short stick. Because it was more practical.
For the terrain.
For the terrain.
Okay. And then we were talking earlier about Mindanao.
Yeah.
Where they favored those thrusting techniques.
The tusada.
The tusada. And is that because...
Well, because if you imagine you're in a narrow trail...
Yeah.
You've got dense undergrowth.
Yeah.
You can't really be swinging a stick around.
Right.
So you need something that's more direct.
And can pierce through the undergrowth.
Exactly.
Okay. And it's not just the environment in terms of the actual landscape.
No.
It's the training realities as well.
Absolutely. So Eskrima, they believe in training for a wide range of challenging conditions.
So what does that mean?
Well, it's not just about practicing in a nice, clean, well-lit gym.
Right.
What about if there are multiple attackers?
Okay.
What about if there are obstacles in your way?
Yeah.
What about if it's raining, if it's muddy?
Right.
What about if you're injured?
Okay.
So they try and incorporate these elements.
It's like they're training.
Yeah, to make it more realistic.
Right.
And they do things like, artificial inhibitions. So you might train with one of your limbs restricted.
Okay.
As if it was injured.
To simulate. Okay. And weapon awareness is a big part.
Huge part
of Eskrima as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a weapon-based art, so you need to understand the different threats.
So what does that involve?
Well, if you're facing someone with a firearm, it's very different.
To a club or a knife.
Exactly. A blunt instrument or an edged weapon.
Yeah.
And you need to understand how to defend against those.
Right.
And also how the grip
of the weapon
will influence your options for defense and disarmament.
Okay. So now we're getting into some of the teaching methodology.
Yeah.
Now I know that the whole approach is popular.
Yeah. That's often used, especially in mass instruction.
Okay. So how does that work?
Well, you would demonstrate the complete technique first to show the students what it looks like as a whole.
Okay.
And then you break it down into these smaller, more manageable chunks.
Right.
And then you put it all back together again.
Okay. Yeah. And there's a structured progression for skill development in Warriors Eskrima.
There is.
So there are 5 stages: learn, practice, polish, flow, enhance. Can you just run through those quickly for me?
Yeah. So learn is all about acquiring the fundamental motor skills.
Right.
and the basic techniques.
Okay.
Practice is about repeating those and integrating them.
Okay.
Polish is about refinement.
Okay.
Really making those movements as powerful and efficient and precise as possible.
Right.
Flow is about connecting those techniques so that they flow seamlessly.
Okay.
So there's continuity and adaptability.
Right.
And enhance is where you personalize it.
Right.
You develop your own strategy and you really understand the underlying principles.
Okay. That makes sense. Now, we can't talk about Eskrima without talking about
The stick.
The stick.
The iconic weapon.
The weapon. So traditionally in duels or bahad, they favored flattened hardwood sticks.
Yeah, they used to use kamagong or bahi.
Kamagong.
Yeah. Really dense hardwoods.
For impact.
Yeah, for those mules. Okay. But for training, they used rattan or olisi.
Yes.
Okay. So why the change?
Well, rattan is a bit more forgiving.
Right.
It's got a bit more give.
Yeah.
So it's safer for training.
Right.
You're less likely to break bones or cause serious injuries.
Okay. So what are the fundamental ways of holding a stick?
Well, you've got the normal grip.
Yeah.
And you've got the reverse grip.
Okay. So normal grip is the bulk of the stick extending from the thumb side of your hand.
Yeah.
Okay. Reverse grip.
The stick extends from the little finger side.
Okay.
And that tends to be favored.
For close quarters.
Yeah, for closer range techniques.
Okay.
And maybe after you've disarmed someone.
Right.
Okay. And then you've got the thumb placement.
On the stick.
Yeah, which is quite important. There are 4 basic variations, and they all give you slightly different advantages in terms of control, power delivery.
Right. And they're useful at different ranges and with different weapons.
Right.
And, the puño or butt of the stick is important because the length of that can vary depending on whether you're using it.
For close quarters.
Yeah, or for competition.
Yeah.
And if it's missing, it completely changes the balance of the stick.
Right.
And how you handle it. And you need to make sure you've got a firm grip.
Yeah.
But not too tense, because otherwise you'll tire yourself out.
Of course.
Yeah.
So then we go on to stances.
Yeah.
So the stances are important.
Yeah, they were the foundational.
Your movement and power.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've got your basic stance, which is just a ready position.
Yeah.
And then you've got things like the abierta.
Yeah, abierta.
Yeah, which is a very stable stance.
Yeah.
And it's good for powerful strikes.
Yeah.
And tip-up blocking.
Okay.
And then you've got the serrata stance.
Serrata.
Which is often used for backhand slashes
Right.
and parrying.
Okay.
So, you can engage...
From different angles.
Yeah, from different angles.
Okay.
And then you've got the tutsada stance.
The tutsada.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which is typically used for thrusting attacks.
Right.
So, each stance has its purpose.
Yeah. So footwork is very important.
Paramount. Absolutely paramount.
Okay.
Especially in a weapon-based system.
Yeah.
Because you need to be able to control your distance and your angles.
Okay.
So evading an attack is just as important as delivering one.
Of course. And switching leads is a key element.
Yeah. So that's constantly changing which foot's forward.
Okay.
And that allows you to be more mobile and create different angles.
Okay. So there are 7 fundamental footwork patterns.
There are.
So run through those quickly for me.
Yeah. So you've got your forward and backward triangle steps.
Yeah.
They're very basic for just moving and changing your lead.
Yeah.
Then you've got the side triangle, which is for lateral movement. And we call that switch hitting when it's combined with striking.
Okay.
And then you've got the pivot.
The pivot.
Which is essential for evading these linear attacks.
Right.
And then you've got the push forward.
Yeah.
And the push back.
Okay.
Which allow you to rapidly engage or disengage.
Okay. So that's the grips, the stances, the footwork. Now we can start talking about targets.
Absolutely. So the targeting system in Eskrima, it's all about understanding the 4 basic types of strikes.
Okay. Go for it.
So you've got the slash.
The slash?
Yes, it's a broad cutting motion.
Okay.
You've got the thrust.
The thrust, which is a direct linear attack.
You've got the wittick.
The wittick.